One of my guilty pleasures when I was a little boy was bubblegum. More so Bubblicious than Bubble Yum. And I wasn't really a candy bar guy, so I stayed away from that. But gum, I'd have 2 or 3 different flavors in my backpack at all times. And my favorite was cherry cola. Because see, with gum, almost every flavor you chewed, it all sort of was the same shade of pink, except cherry cola had a little bit more of an electric pink color to it, and the taste was tremendous. Then, of course, I watched 1988's The Blob when I was 8 years old. And I never f***ing chewed gum ever again. Full disclosure here, friends, I was never amped about watching this movie the first time that I saw it, because it was sold to me as alien comes down from the stars, crashes on Earth, starts taking out people one at a time. I mean, this had been done to death. And on top of that, we're getting the other Dylan as our leading man. Where are we going with this? The quickest way for me to settle into a movie, though, is set it in a great-looking town, and we get one here. Gremlins had one, Silver Bullet had one, and this one is absolutely no different. Very great storefronts, big marquee on a cinema, everything you would want in a town that you were growing up in. But when we see it, it looks deserted, and it makes me wonder, are we joining before or after whatever happened here happened? And you can't have true blue small town Americana without a football game that the whole community is attending, and that's exactly where we lead off here. We've got Paul, the football player, trying his best to impress Meg, the cheerleader. Meg is played by Shawnee Smith, and for those of you who don't know Shawnee Smith, she's one of the brighter spots of the Saw franchise, in my humble opinion. Then we meet the bad boy of the film, because every film has to have a bad boy, and Brian Flagg here is our bad boy. He's played by Kevin Dillon, not Matt Dillon, Kevin Dillon. Now hang with me on this one. He's off in the woods by himself, looking cool in his leather jacket, drinking a beer, smoking a square, and he's trying to figure out how he's going to jump his motorcycle across the broken bridge that lay before him. And he gets a pretty good start. Then we cut back and forth to the football game. I thought it was really cool how they did that. They show the roaring of the crowd at the game, and then the revving of the engine over here in the woods with Mr. Brian Flagg. Now, he starts off well, and then his bike malfunctions, causing him to tumble into the ditch below. Watching from afar is an old man who lives out there with his dog, and the old man comes along and politely collects the empty beer can that Brian has discarded. A staple of any good town like the one we're in with this movie, is a great place to eat. And we wind up at a diner that introduces us to Fran the waitress and our sheriff. Now, if you didn't know who the sheriff was, he's Dale from the first 2 seasons of Walking Dead. And on rewatch, I was really happy to see that, because a lot of people didn't like Dale. I didn't mind Dale. Now, for those of you who didn't have the joy of diner dining in your diet when you were a kid, you're missing out on great things. Pinball games, jukeboxes, occasionally a pool table if the older kids will let you get on it, and some of the best, if not unhealthiest, diner food you could possibly wrap your lips around. Absolutely nothing better. Brian has himself a tense run-in with the sheriff. As the sheriff's leaving the diner, tells us that there's a little bit of history there. Obviously, this town is not a big fan of Brian's, but he borrows a couple of tools from a close-by mechanic who happens to be working on a snow machine. Plays into the movie later on, and he goes back to the woods to work on his bike. Now, when we get there, that same old man is crushing cans with his dog watching closely. As they're doing that, though, something comes racing down, cutting through the sky, ultimately embedding itself in the earth below. Just as we're getting to our first scene that could be considered scary, we cut to a drugstore where Paul, the star football player, is there with his buddy Scott. And Scott's intentions are, because Scott's got a hot date that night, Scott's going to buy some rubbers. And the pharmacist happily helps him with whatever he needs, disappears to go get Scott's order, and then the Reverend shows up. And as the pharmacist returns with Scott's wares and loudly asks Scott if he wants the regular or the ribbed in front of the Reverend, Scott's now got a safe face. So Scott decides, I'm going to blame this whole thing on Paul, who's hanging out over by the magazine rack, just so the Reverend doesn't think I am some deviant out there doing God knows what to God knows who. The pharmacist is not a fan of the way Scott is describing Paul, and more specifically what Paul's intentions are with the condoms that Scott is buying. Scott tells the pharmacist and the Reverend that Paul's taking out a naive girl that he plans on taking advantage of. Everybody in that scene looks at Paul with nothing but disgust. As funny as that scene was, I wanted to get back to the woods. I wanted to know what was going on with this old guy in this crash site. Now, there's small fires all over the place, and then the old man with his dog by his side sees some sort of a rock embedded in the middle of all of it with a crack down the center of the rock and a pink oozing substance bubbling up from the crack. Nothing about this looks approachable or screams, "Hey, come touch me." But this guy picks up a branch or a fairly big stick, goes down there and pokes at it. Now, he winds up picking this substance out of the crater or the rock or whatever we want to call it, looks at it closely until this thing slides down the branch and attaches itself to his hand. And again, they take us away from the action, but they put us smack dab in the middle of a kitchen where Meg's parents are. Her little brother's sitting there with his friend. They're planning their evening, going to the theater to watch the latest slasher film. Now, this scene spoke to my heart because that was me as a child. I loved getting those movie advertisements in the newspaper, finding what was playing, finding what time it was playing, and begging my parents to take me. Now, this is where things start to get a little bit fun for me because when Paul arrives at the house to pick up Meg, Meg has to first introduce Paul to her dad. And they go in the den where the dad is sitting there reading the newspaper, which is what all dads were stereotypically doing in the 80s. And the paper slowly comes down, and the guy sitting there, Meg's father, is actually the pharmacist that had just witnessed Paul hours prior buying rubbers for his hot date, who just so happens to be his little girl. Perfect scene. Very, very funny. With Brian hanging tight in the woods, trying to get his bike fixed, that old man happens upon him with that substance still wrapped tightly around his hand. So tightly, in fact, and so painful that this guy pulls out a hatchet and goes to cut his own wrist off. And he does it. He cuts into himself, but then the blob covers the wound, thus getting even tighter and possibly getting inside of this old man's body. Very gnarly. Brian chases the old timer, who runs off. They head up to the road, and wouldn't you know it, Meg and Paul just so happen to hit this guy with Paul's car. Now, after a back and forth between the three teens, they all decide they're going to take this old man to the hospital, and you see a bit of a softer side here with Brian because he kneels down to the old man who's in a wheelchair, getting wheeled back to be looked at by the doctor. Brian tells him, "Don't worry about it, old dude. You're going to be fine. These guys are going to fix you right up." That was really cool because you saw this guy had a heart. He's got a bad reputation, but at the root of it, he seems to be a pretty good guy. So in every horror movie, you have a pivot point where things just start to go haywire for the cast. Everything comes up at the peak, and then boom, bodies start to fall. This happens here when Paul gets up to go get Meg a soda. He's at the soda machine. He looks in and sees the old man's room, the old man laying in bed, and then something moving under the old man's blanket. Now, of course, why wouldn't you go investigate that? Don't go get the doctor. Go look at it yourself. You're a high school football player. I guarantee you could figure out what's going on with that guy. Now, once this blanket on this old man gets pulled back, you see that whatever that substance was on his hand has eaten through everything from the shoulders down of this guy. Paul trips out. Normal reaction to such a thing. Goes into an office, gets on a phone, and starts to call somebody. That's when we realize the blob has grown tremendously, and Paul gets to meet this thing firsthand. The scene where Meg finds Paul with the blob draped over him and slowly eating away at him is iconic. The picture of it is iconic. It's the thumbnail of this video. It's on the VHS sleeve. It's just something that you have seen at one point in your life as a horror fan or as a movie consumer. Strangely enough, though, after Paul's death, the cops actually think that Brian is somehow responsible for this corrosive matter invading the town and eating through people. I guess when people die in a town, you look to the person with the worst reputation. That just so happened to be Brian. I was glad at this point that we got to see what went on with Scott, because you want Scott to get a little bit of comeuppance for setting Paul up as a pervert in the pharmacy. And we see that he's out on a date with Vicky, who is played by the stunning Erica Eleniak. If you don't know who she is, you gotta Google her right now. That's who he wanted the condoms for, and he's putting the full court press on this girl. But she seems like she's had one too many, and she's starting to fall asleep in the car. Now, Scott goes ahead in his impressive trunk bar and makes her another cocktail. I'm not really sure why he does that, but he does. I mean, she's already passing out. She's not going to be able to drink another drink, but he tries anyways. Unfortunately, he leaves the driver's side door open when he does it. And as he climbs back in and starts to look down her shirt and starts to help himself to a feel down her shirt, he realizes that the blob, which he doesn't know what it is at the time, but there's a substance inside of his girlfriend, and it's eating her from the inside out. Gets all over his hand, attacks him. Brutal way to go for two young kids. And as this blob consumes more, it grows that much larger. And that is scary as shit when you think about how big this thing could end up being in a town this size. The next place we see our puffy pink friend is the diner that we now love. I've grown fond of this place. Fran is just a joy, and she has a date with the sheriff later that night that she's very much looking forward to. However, here she is, it's after hours. She does make Brian a sandwich because he shows up after a long day of being harassed by cops and taking in hobos to hospitals to fix and arguing with star football players and flirting with their girlfriends. It's been a day for Brian. So he gets a sandwich out of the deal. Meg shows up, tries to convince Brian of what she saw at the hospital and what happened to Paul. And as they do that, they hear a crash and a scream from the kitchen. Going into the kitchen, they see that through the sink, the blob has grabbed the dishwasher and is bringing him down into the sounds and what we see when that body gets sucked into that drain. It's gnarly. And then, of course, the blob decides to spit out of the drain up under the ceiling, and the chase is on. The diner scene here is a great scene because it's great character work. Meg and Brian really start to bond a little bit. They start to form a little bit of a partnership here, and you know they're going to be able to rely on one another for most of the movie. Fran is really good here, and she's terrified of what she sees happen to her dishwasher, and then the blob's just really scary. And we find out when the blob is chasing Brian and Meg that there might be a bit of a weakness to this thing because they hide in the freezer and he tries to crawl into the freezer under the cracks, and once it hits the cold, it shrivels up and disappears. That happens to us sometimes. But what happens to Fran in the phone booth really did nothing to alleviate my claustrophobia when I was a little kid, because she's in the phone booth, she's trying to call out for help, and the part where she calls the sheriff's office and dispatch explains to her the sheriff already went to the diner to try to help out, and then she looks at the blob, which is slowly dripped down over the entire phone booth, and then she sees the sheriff's body float in front of her, partially eaten by this thing. Just wicked scene. It was just woof. Now, Brian and Meg wind up running into a group of government officials in hazmat type suits who explain that they believe this thing, this organism that landed in their fair town, is the same sort of thing that wiped out the dinosaurs millions of years prior. They plan on quarantining the whole town, and Brian hates that idea, and Meg is just happy that somebody with some sort of authority or the idea of help has arrived. Now, they basically force Brian and Meg into the van because Brian has no intention of going along with them because he's a bad guy. And bad guys, bad boys, they don't respect authority. You respect authority, then all of a sudden you're a good boy and your whole reputation's ruined. Brian winds up breaking out of this van as it's racing down the road, but Megan decides she's not going along because she needs to find her parents. She wants to make sure that they're okay. Speaking of finding her family, once Meg does, she realizes her little brother is not with her mom and dad. And because of this, she's got to rush off to the theater to find him before whatever this thing is happens to find him. Guess what? That thing finds them because the theater scene is another one of the amazing scenes in this movie. And imagine my surprise when I learned that the lesser-known frog brother from Lost Boys was the theater usher here. So when they cut to the theater scene, I popped for that switch because we go from the movie we've had for the last 45 minutes or so, and then all of a sudden we're watching a slasher film, and it's a knockoff, an obvious knockoff of Friday the 13th, but it's cool because imitation is a serious form of flattery, and I'll take a cheap imitation of a slasher film at this point. I would take any version of Friday the 13th at this point. We need another one. But they're watching this, and on top of all that, the couple that they're watching in the slasher film are about to have sex in front of a gardener that they're not familiar with. And the 80s were just that wild, y'all. But the entire theater scene, completely amazing, top to bottom. The projectionist gets it, the theater manager gets it, very gnarly, and then that thing decides to drop from the projection booth. It starts to climb over the seats, swallowing up everybody in the movie theater as it does. Now, Meg is able to get there, and she's able to help her little brother and her little brother's best friend. The chase, though, with the Blob coming after them is tremendous. There's several close calls. Her brother's jacket gets caught in the door. It's very tense. They wind up in the sewer. And there's a scene in Aliens that I love. And Newt has slid away during an attack from Ripley. And she's down in the depths. I mean, she's down in water. And they're trying to get to her. They're lasering the grate. I'm sure you guys have all seen it, because who hasn't seen Aliens? But this is really similar, because in Aliens, she's sitting there in the water waiting for somebody to help. And then all of a sudden an alien comes up behind her. Here they're in the sewer and they're wading through water, and they see rats down there that start to get sucked underneath. And she realizes that thing is under the water coming after them. Super tense. Great callback to that movie. I don't know if they did that intentionally, but I really dug that. And I was blown away because Meg's brother's best friend ends up dying at the hands of this big, gross, gnarly thing that probably went to Duke University. It's not often you see a kid get killed in these movies, but man, they dispatched this dude in a legendary way. Brian goes back to the woods to get his bike and to get out of town. But he sees those government goofs lifting that crater that thing showed up in, and he realizes that's got an American flag on the side of it. And then he hears the muckety-mucks and the bigwig talking about, well, everybody in this town is expendable. Then he hears over the radio that the Blob is in the sewers and it's after Meg. That's when Brian decides to go full-born last action hero, Mission Impossible. He takes his motorcycle into the tunnels, into the sewers, looking for this girl. And we even get a Bill Moseley sighting in this movie, which is always fantastic in any horror film to have that guy pay us a visit. And thanks to the rocket launcher that Bill's carrying with him, Brian and Meg are able to blast their way out of the sewers with the Blob hot on their trails. They wrap this movie up very nicely, in my opinion. It ties in some elements from previous horror films, as well as includes some tidbits from this one that we maybe didn't realize would play a big role in the end. The town barricades themselves once the Blob shows itself to everybody in the middle of town square. They wind up barricading themselves in a church, I believe it is, which reminded me of a much larger scene from Night of the Living Dead. And speaking of church, does anybody know why that reverend was so obsessed with this creature? One of the more impressive things about this movie is that the cast, it just works well together. Now, there's not really a whole lot of big names amongst any of them, but everybody did their part and they played it so well. Shawnee Smith is a certified badass. She made a stunning, believable final girl. She plays a pivotal role in saving Brian at the end of this movie. Kevin Dillon is so believable as our hero, and he really carves a spot out for himself with this movie. And you're not really worried about who his other brother is, because he belongs here, and this is a great showcase for him. Very well written. What impressed me most, I think, was you really liked a lot of these characters, and that's not because the characters themselves were particularly memorable, but the way that this creature killed these folks, it was just brutal and visceral and a nasty way to go. So when you see their time on screen slowly ticking away, it's really unsettling. The movie's amazing and timeless, and yet another movie that I'm very happy that they have not remade to death here. It's a wonderful horror movie to sit down with, and the only thing I didn't like about this rewatch was it made me regret never having seen it in the theater before. I never watched this anywhere but VHS. And it's going to age gracefully for me. It's a 9.5 out of 10, and it would have been a perfect score, but it took away my love of Cherry Cola Bubblicious, and for that, I will never forgive it. This is Aging Gracefully. I am Matthew Essex. I'll see you on the other side.